Bob, Sarah, John. I'm going to echo a lot of what you have to say and hopefully tell some other stories as well. I can't help but look out into this crowd and just see so many friendly and familiar faces, and also fantasize about Doug being here and what that might have been like. Especially glad to see Gail and Catherine, Cameron, and Rob. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Rolleri, and I'm going to share some stories about Doug over the last few years that I hope are interesting to you, and I hope inspire us in some way to carry on his very important work. Doug has been called a leader today. He's been called a researcher, an educator, a scientist, an author, and an advocate. And Doug was all those things, but to me, Doug was also a coworker, a mentor, and a friend. Among the many lessons I learned from Doug, the coworker, and Doug, the mentor, were how to ask big questions, how to think more systematically, and how to develop programs so that every activity of every component is directly linked up with the program goal. Everything is purposeful. He raised my standards for what it means to do thorough and rigorous research, and he modeled what it means to be politic and diplomatic while still staying true to research data, professional ethics, and personal values. Let me start from the beginning. As a graduate student at UNC in the mid-90s, I cited Doug's work in numerous papers, but I never had the opportunity to meet him personally until I joined ETR in 1999. During my first week, ETR had scheduled its annual board luncheon, where staff and board members come together and celebrate the year's achievements. To encourage everyone to mingle, table seating was determined by having each staff and board member randomly pick a small toy from a bag and then sit at the table with others who picked the same toy. As luck would have it, as I approached my table, there was one seat left, next to Doug Kirby, who's wearing one of his trademark blue shirts. I can't remember if it's cornflower blue or robin's egg blue or baby blue, but it was a medium blue. Even though I met Doug earlier in the week, I was still a little starstruck. So I immediately went into best behavior mode and just prayed I wouldn't say anything stupid. Wait till you hear what happened. After we exchanged some pleasantries, Doug asked me a little bit about my background before coming to ETR. At some point I told him I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras. And usually when I tell people I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I hear things like, oh, what was your experience like? Or what was it like to be away from home all that time? And what was it like to adjust to the culture? Not Doug. He acknowledged how interesting the experience must have been, and then to my complete surprise, and with that focused and serious face, asked me, so, how do you think we can get rid of poverty in the developing world? So much for not somebody to say anything stupid. Doug wasn't trying to show off his intellectual prowess, so stumped me with a question. He wanted to get to the bottom of things, and poverty was certainly a major underlying problem affecting most of what I did as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'll never forget that day because it was the first of many times that Doug taught me how important it is to ask big questions and to keep in mind that anybody, even somebody fresh out of graduate school like I was, might have an important idea to contribute. He gave me permission and encouraged me over and over again to think big, even if doing so was difficult or daunting. Of course, as the years went on and I got to know Doug more, I realized that Doug's career was all about asking big questions and finding answers, or at least being on the lookout for those emerging answers. I think Doug took on answering big questions for two reasons. First, he was a skilled researcher with an insatiable sense of curiosity. And second, he wanted to find answers that he could share with people on the ground that were doing the important work with people in need. Much of what Doug accomplished in the last two decades of his career made adolescent reproductive health research understandable and usable by thousands of practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. His work on BDI logic models, the characteristics of effective sex curricula, effective HIV prevention programs in Africa, and so many more titles that I can't mention now, cross borders, continents, and language barriers. It is no exaggeration to say that Doug's work changed the world. My favorite story about the impact of Doug's work comes from a BDI logic model training that Mary Martha Wilson from HTN at the time and I did in Seattle a few years ago. During the training, we introduced Doug's review of risk and protective factors that I think maybe Bob Blum had helped with in some capacity. The review lists 504 risk and protective factors associated with sexual risk-taking behavior. But it's more than that. It also identifies each risk and protective factor, each factor as being either a risk factor, a protective factor, or neutral, having no effect on the behavior. But wait, there's more. It also adds a number to each of those factors that you could then go in the back of the paper and look up the actual citation to the study if that was something, if that particular factor was of interest to you. Incredibly thorough, as was most of Doug's work. Mary Martha and I instructed the trainees to take a break. I went out into the hall and got onto the elevator to go downstairs to get some coffee. And as the elevator door started to close, two of our trainees came onto the elevator. I was already in the back of the elevator, so they didn't notice me. I heard one of the trainees remark on how much she was enjoying the training. Immediately a smile came to my face. And the other trainee said, yes, and that risk and protective factor is going to be great for a grant we're writing. My smile got a little wider. And the other trainee continued, oh, I know. That whole paper is just orgasmic. Imagine if all the work we did had that kind of impact on practitioners. What a better world this would be, or at least a world with a lot less sexual